We've now got a better idea of how classes work in Dart, so in this section we're going to move forward and start working on our next application that is going to make heavy use of classes. Let's get started by talking about what we're going to be making. Alright, so you and I are going to make a little program that's going to simulate a deck of playing cards, like the same kind of cards you would use to play poker or blackjack or even go fish for that matter. Inside of our deck of cards will be a list of 52 different cards. Every card will have a rank, which would be like the ace, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and a suit, which would be diamonds, hearts, spades, and clubs. I want to make sure that our program is going to have some reasonable amount of functionality so that it can simulate actually playing with a real deck of playing cards. So for example, inside of our program, I want to have the ability to create a new deck of cards. We should have the ability to, say, shuffle the cards inside that deck, and also deal a new hand of cards as well. So let's take a pause right here. We're going to come back in the next section and start talking about the design process of how we're going to actually make this application. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a moment. In the last section, we started talking about the next application that we're going to be working on. This application is going to have a heavy focus on object-oriented programming, particularly on the design aspect of how we set up the different classes inside of our application. So to that end, I put together a diagram that's going to help walk us through a design approach for designing our application. So here's the diagram on the screen right here. The diagram is a little bit confusing. We start off first at the top left-hand box, then we move over to the green one to the right of that, and then we go down to the next row, and so on. So inside this section, you and I are going to tackle this first row here. We're going to start off by thinking about the different types of things that exist inside of our application. And then we'll create a Dart class to represent each of those things. Then over time, we'll start to add on fields and add on methods to those classes as well. Now before we start walking through the design of this cards application, I just want to throw out there really quick that inside of any object-oriented programming approach program, there's not necessarily one right way of doing things. There might be several different designs that are totally appropriate to use inside this application and throughout all the other apps that we're going to work on through this course. So if you come up with your own design that you think works better, that's totally fine. There's nothing to say that your design is right or my design is right. They're just different approaches. So with that in mind, let's think about some of the different types of things, or classes essentially, that exist inside of our cards application. Now as I look at this diagram right here, I really see two separate things. I think the first kind of thing that we might want to model inside of our application would be very obvious. It might be an individual card. So we might have an individual card class that represents every single card inside of our application. But then the second thing that kind of exists here, that's kind of a little bit harder to see, is the overall collection of cards as well, or the overall deck of cards. A card by itself is kind of meaningless. A card by itself really just has a suit and a rank, like the ace of diamonds. It's only when we take a collection of cards and assemble them together do we get some actual meaning out of our program. So in total, I think we have two separate things here. I think we have a deck class that's going to have some number of fields and methods tied to it, and I think we're also going to have a card class that's also going to have some number of fields and methods tied to it. So with that in mind, let's move on the diagram. So this step 2 right here says that we're going to create a class to represent each type of thing that we're going to have inside of our app. So I'm going to flip back over to Dartpad. I've still got a bunch of code here. If you want to, you could certainly copy paste this over to some other file and save a reference to it. But for me, I'm just going to highlight all of it and delete it. And then I'll create two separate classes. The first one is going to represent the deck of cards. And then the second one will represent an individual card by itself. Okay, so very humble beginnings here. Let's take a pause and we'll continue with step 2 of this flow right here inside the next section. So quick break and I'll see you in just a minute.